All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Make sure we're mindful of everybody's time. We really appreciate everybody joining the second session here. I'm sure more people will be joining as we move along, but for those who have just joined, please use the chat feature again to introduce yourself, and for CE purposes, we need your name, your email, your organization, and your credentials. Feel free to drop that in the chat at any time. As a reminder, use the chat to ask any questions you might have during the presentation or case presentation, raise hand feature. And also, if you have any tech questions or anything like that, you can drop those in the chat, or you can direct message me and I'll take care of those on the side. And if anything comes up during the sessions, or if something seems frozen or something like that, please shout out. It's hard to see all the Hollywood squares when we're sharing the screen and stuff like that, so just let us know. But we got a good session today. Presentation from Marie Newcomb Richmond, sorry, tongue-tied today. And then also a case presentation from Dr. Cynthia Pursley. So we're gonna be doing those two things. We're gonna start with the didactic presentation today. So I will go ahead and share my screen, and then Marie, you just tell me when you want to advance the slides. Give me 1 second. Okay, you just have to go unmute, Marie. You're still muted, and then you can take it away.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Thank you all for this opportunity to participate in this educational experience. I'll do a couple of disclaimers in the beginning. I am not an attorney. I don't play one on TV, and I didn't stay at Holiday Inn Express last night. However, I have spent most of my working career in inpatient healthcare settings, including inpatient psychiatric units. So I'm very, very familiar with HIPAA in those particular situations. So this was not only an opportunity for me to refresh my memory about that, but to learn a lot more about FERPA. So next, our objectives this afternoon are to talk about some of the history and the differences between FERPA and HIPAA, talking about how those two things are applicable in emergency situations, talk a little bit about the legal and professional standards and impact confidentiality, talking about the importance of interdepartmental planning and communication, and talk about best practices for institutes of higher education regarding management of crises. Next slide. Okay. So, and I apologize for this being a very busy slide, but I felt like it was important for us to at least first visit why confidentiality and communication around mental health and around keeping our campuses safe is so important. On the left-hand side, you'll see the importance of confidentiality. Fear of lack of confidentiality is a key barrier in students seeking help. I can't tell you how many students that come see me that their biggest concern is whether or not their parents or their teachers would find out about them coming to counseling. The confidential nature of counseling services is an essential part of the therapeutic process that we provide. It's also very important for us to prevent stigmatization and discrimination of individuals based on people's perceptions of someone having a mental illness or an actual diagnosis. And of course, the other piece is that we have to comply with a number of national and state statutes, as well as our own professional codes of ethics. So then why do we need to communicate with one another about sometimes confidential information? And those are that it is in the best interest of the student, particularly if there's a situation where they're doing something that could be a danger to themselves or others. It does increase the opportunity for early intervention in a least restrictive environment. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Again, it may be necessary for the safety of the student, their peers, faculty, staff, and the university campus. Interdepartmental communication can help facilitate identification of gaps in service or processes. And I find that especially true in the last couple of weeks when we had a very similar situation to the one that Dr. Pursley is going to present, where we identified some gaps in our processes. And lastly, it provides an opportunity for us interdepartmentally to increase understanding of psychiatric diagnoses, treatment options, and better equipped non-clinical staff to respond and support the clinical functions that we have on campus. So one of the things that I enjoyed when I was doing research for this was kind of looking at some landmark court cases that involve confidentiality and sharing of information amongst departments on university campuses. And you all are probably familiar with these. There was a court case with MIT with a young lady who died as a result of burns due to a fire in her dorm room. The parents sued, and because this particular institution had a higher rate of suicide than had been expected, and they ended up settling out of court. But that was a case, again, where we had a situation that someone had a prior history of difficulty, and again, the university's responsibility to make sure that she was safe. The University of California versus Rosen, that was when a student was injured by a peer who had been exhibiting problematic behavior. That one originally went to, she argued that the college had a responsibility to protect her from another student. The first trial, when they took that to court, the decision went to say, no, the college didn't have responsibility. And then she appealed it to the Supreme Court in California, and they overrode the first decision, saying that we do have responsibility, at least in California, they have responsibility to maintain the safety of the campus for everybody. And of course, the Virginia Tech situation that we're all very familiar with. And then the last one, actually there's two, the University of Oregon, this one is really bothersome. A student was sexually assaulted and sued the school because she didn't feel like the process was done correctly, and the school used her treatment information as part of their case against her. That was back in 2014. Carolyn told me just a few minutes ago about another situation at Harvard where a third party released information about a student. And I haven't read that one yet, so I'm looking forward to doing that. So our communication and confidentiality is very much important, not only to the safety of our campuses, but for the individual. Next slide, please. So we have two federal statutes that are applicable to talking about privacy of information. The first one, of course, is FERPA, which was enacted in 1974, came out of a lot of legislation, including the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that was enacted to give parents or eligible students more control of who saw their educational records. It prohibits educational institutions from disclosing personally identifiable information in education records without written consent. HIPAA followed much later in 1996, and it was actually developed because of the increased use of electronic communication between entities and the concern for privacy. So it is a national standard, again, to protect patient information from being disclosed without the person's consent or knowledge. And it's, again, it covers people providing healthcare as well as some public health issues. Next slide. So who do FERPA and HIPAA apply to? FERPA, of course, is any public or private school from elementary to post-secondary. any state or local education agency. All of those to fall under FERPA must receive funding under one of the programs of the Department of Education. HIPAA applies to healthcare providers who electronically transmit information. It applies to healthcare plans, healthcare clearinghouses, and businesses who participate in billing and processing of information. So HIPAA and FERPA are intertwined. However, the HIPAA privacy rule expressly excludes education and treatment records, which I'll talk about in a minute, of eligible students under FERPA from both the privacy and security rules. Next slide. So what's considered protected information? Under FERPA, it's the student education record, which is defined as records that contain information directly related to the student that are maintained by the educational agency or by a party acting for the agency. HIPAA covers individually identifiable health information that's transmitted, maintained by a covered entity or business associate. And it excludes, again, certain educational and employment records. Next slide. Oh, wait, back up, I'm sorry. So under FERPA, medical records, including counseling records, are considered to be educational records. However, there is a clause under FERPA that can qualify that information as a treatment record if it meets the 3 criteria. It has to be directly related to the student who's 18 years old or older at an institution of post-secondary education. It's made or maintained by a physician, psychiatrist, psychologist, or other professional. And it's made and maintained and used only in connection with the provision of treatment to the student. And it's not available to anybody else, including the student, other than persons providing the treatment. So other personal reviews done by a physician or appropriate professionals of the student's choice. Disclosure of those records to anybody other than under those 3 situations described above, including release to the student, means that the record won't fall under the treatment record exemption, and it becomes part of the education record. Again, HIPAA doesn't apply to education records or treatment records under FERPA, even if a HIPAA covered entity is part of the mix. However, if an institution is also treating other folks in their clinics on the campus, outside folks such as faculty, staff, or folks from the community, their records and operations do fall under HIPAA. Next slide. So what's considered permitted disclosure? Again, it means the information can be, but is not required to be shared with an individual to be shared without individual authorization. And of course, protected information includes things like demographic information, the chart notes and the information that's generated in the course of treatment, and the other things that become part of the record. Next slide. So permitted disclosures under FERPA include school officials, and FERPA gives the institution the opportunity to designate who a school official is and what's a legitimate educational interest. Sometimes, again, it can be released to student specified officials for audit or evaluation purposes, other appropriate parties in connection with financial aid, and organizations conducting studies for or on behalf of the school. Accrediting organizations, officials in the case of health and safety emergencies, state and local authorities within the juvenile justice system pursuant to state law, and in compliance with court orders and lawful subpoenas. Next slide, please. Under HIPAA, pretty much the same thing, but that HIPAA also allows for release of information to the individual. And it doesn't change the the legal status of the record if it's shared with the individual. Obviously, because HIPAA is designed to streamline the billing and payment system, that's a permitted disclosure. Uses and disclosures with the opportunity to agree or object by asking the individual whether they give consent. Also, public interest and benefit activities like public health, victims of abuse or neglect, some types of research, law enforcement purposes, and serious threats to health and safety. And they also can release limited data sets without identifiable information for the purpose of research, public health or healthcare operations. Next slide, please. So FERPA in emergency situations, and I'm not going to read that to you. Basically, it's a flexible standard. It requires that if we have an articulable and significant threat to health and safety of other individuals, that information could be shared with law enforcement and other interinstitutional folks. It does not allow for a blanket release of information. We should disclose only the information that's needed to protect the student or others. So we wouldn't release actual records. A summary or a statement of relevant and necessary information would be sufficient. Next slide, please. HIPAA also has clauses for release of information that are very, very similar. Again, emergency situations where safety and health are threatened. HIPAA can release for public health reasons, as well as the other things that are mentioned here. Next slide. So we have these two federal laws that are covering us. We also have state law and professional licensing rules. And I just put, for example, the two licensure rules that cover the Board of Examiners and Counseling and the Board of Social Work Examiners that explicitly outline for folks that are licensed by those two groups what their permitted disclosures can be. FERPA's permissive exceptions don't preempt state law that might be more stringent. And the rule is always, you go by what's the most stringent law or what's the word I'm looking for? Policy that is in existence to guide you. Next slide. In addition to state laws, we also have our codes of ethics. Depending on your license, your licensure board may be using a national organization of your profession to delegate your ethical standards. But here's just an example of a few. Obviously, if people are members of professional organizations, they also fall under the codes of ethics for those organizations. We can skip the next one. So I'm paying attention to my time. Other entities that may be subject to receiving information and discussing and deciding processes would be our institutional policies and processes, insurance carriers. If you have malpractice insurance, being familiar with what your institution's policies and procedures is important, as well as your malpractice policies and procedures. And of course, always there are situations that we need to seek legal advice if we're uncertain about particular things, particularly if it goes to litigation. But it's, again, and I'm not going to go through that. So, because I want to have time to talk about the essential values in responding to mental health crises. Next slide, please. The best practice is ethical practice. And Dr. Persley said it best last week when she said, we do what's right for the person in the moment. So to do that, we want to certainly avoid harm. We want to intervene in person-centered ways. We want a shared responsibility with the individual. We want to be aware of past or present trauma. We want to make sure that there's a feeling of personal safety amongst everybody, that it's strengths-based, that we consider the whole person, not just the crisis that we're in at the moment, that we embrace the concept of the person as being a credible source. And I like to think of it as the person that's sitting in front of me is the expert of themselves. They know themselves better than anyone else. And client-centered therapy says that we make that a credible part of assessment as well as treatment. And then lastly, that we be sure that we're including and thinking about recovery, resilience, and other natural supports for the individuals. Some issues that arise when we get into crises include paralysis, inactivity, and lack of collaboration. The idea of what's convenient versus doing due diligence. And lastly, that we will be emotionally triggered, at times possibly overwhelmed, and we might have insufficient knowledge in certain areas. Next slide, please. So I located something that was really, really informative to me that I'm going to be taking to our threat assessment team and our mental health committee, is the SAMHSA best practices for guidelines to respond to mental health crises. Timely access to service in the least restrictive manner, peer support, adequate time to complete an assessment and develop an action plan. Again, strengths-based, that emergency interventions consider the context of the individual's overall plan of service, that the people that are providing the crisis service will then have appropriate training and demonstrated competency to effectively intervene. Next slide, please. Individuals in a self-defined crisis are not turned away. Again, the people intervening need to have a comprehensive understanding of the crisis. Individuals needs to be aided to regain a sense of control. And as disturbing and just overwhelming as a crisis might be to us, the person experiencing the crisis is much, much more having that difficulty with feeling out of control. And if we can help them feel in control, we probably are going to go a long, long way to resolving the conflict. That our services are they're provided in a culturally competent manner, that we respect people's rights, again, that they're trauma-informed interventions. If we have recurring incidents of the same thing with the same person or recurring incidents of the same type of emergency, then that's a red flag that says, wait a minute, we need to look at our processes. And then taking steps that will decrease the likelihood that we're going to have a future crisis. Additional things that we can do are ensuring that our policies that we have don't discourage our students from seeking help. Our mental health staff can provide education and consultation to committees relating to education and disciplinary issues. We can encourage student-to-student outreach and knowledge of whom to contact if they have a concern about someone. And then we can also have education and training with focus on identifying pathology, knowing how to make referrals, things like that, and of course, our threat assessment teams. I will give a plug for Campus Connect, which is something that we launched our first session a couple of weeks ago, and we're going to be doing that campus-wide. Very, 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 very good program for gatekeeper training that's very comprehensive in terms of helping folks feel equipped to be able to handle mental health emergencies. Resources that I've listed, just a few. I will tell you that the Bazelon Center for Health, Law and Ethics is one of my favorite places because they have a great deal of information surrounding mental health rights, and they have a great policy for supporting students. Of course, the Department of Education has a lot of guidance. Also like the JED Foundation's Starting the Conversation, which is a really nice book that talks to parents as well as students about talking about the high risk that they're at because of their developmental stage and the fact that they're in college. So those are just a few of the resources that I've utilized. I have more if folks are interested. Last slide. And I left it with a quote from Fred Rogers, that anything that's human is mentionable and anything that's mentionable can be more manageable. When we can talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming, less upsetting, and less scary. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. I grew up in, no pun intended, but Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. That's where I grew up. So big Mr. Rogers fan. So great quote. So we'll open it up for questions. Again, you can use the chat if you don't want to speak up, or you can unmute or use your a raise hand feature. Any questions on the presentation?
Someone's knocking at my door, so I need to go if there's something going on.
Okay. All right. If there aren't any questions, we can move on to the case presentation. But if you do think of one or anything like that, please pop it in the chat. We can always revisit it. We want to make sure we have a good discussion for both sections. So feel free to drop that in there. But we can go ahead and move forward to the case presentation. Dr. Pursley, I will share my screen and you can walk us through it. Just give me 1 second. Okay, as you see in the chat, you are absolutely going to get a copy of the presentation. Absolutely. That'll come out in the recap email. You'll get that. So with all the links and everything like that. Great question. Okay. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you, Margaret, for really teeing up this case, because I think a lot of the things that you've talked about, especially systems issues as well as crisis paralysis, are alive and well in this particular case. So as you listen to the case, we'd like for you to be considering these questions, really about where did the system break down for the student? Were there any breaches in confidentiality? Margaret has given you a really great overview of FERPA and HIPAA. So were there any breaches in confidentiality for this particular student? What assessments could the CTC counseling office perhaps have done? How could the system have better protected the student? What information will help transition this student safely to the care of hospital personnel? What education do you recommend for the team once the patient is safe, the student is safe? And then how can the student be transitioned back into the workplace and the college safely? Again, considering what Margaret just talked about those best practices, being person-centered, getting the person the right level of support that they need. So here's the background information on this particular case. This is a 32-year-old male student at the local community and technical college. And while this is a community and technical college example, when you hear about this, this could happen in any of our college and university systems. In this particular case, the student is enrolled in a Learn and Earn program. So he spends a portion of his time at a partner employer as an apprentice, and then a portion of his time at the community and technical college. And for those of you who are in four-year and professional schools, we have equivalents in those schools as well. Students are doing clinical practice or student teaching or research off campus. And so we can see this situation in any college or university. The student has a preceptor at the partner employer, and that preceptor has noted some changes in the student's behavior. He's been coming late to his assigned workstation. He spends more time on breaks. He's disheveled in his appearance. And this student has a therapeutic support dog. And the preceptor reports that the dog has been on guard for the last 2 weeks. The student has been talking about how he doesn't think it's worth for him to go on with his education, but he's not providing any specifics to the preceptor. And I think it's important to note that these were changes in the student's behavior that the preceptor noted over time. So what happens is the partner employer, the preceptor, goes to their HR department with concerns for the student. Typically, that might be the route that someone would take within the workplace. The HR office then calls the workforce office at the Community and Technical College on Thursday with a report relative to their concerns. On Friday, the workforce office work study student leaves a message for the workforce director, but that person is out until Monday. On Monday, the workforce director calls the student, brings the student into her office to assess the situation before the student reports to the workplace. The workforce director notices those same changes as the workplace has and calls the counselor on campus, but that counselor is with clients, calls back at noon on lunch break. The workforce director in the meantime has called the student's girlfriend about her concerns about the student, and this girlfriend reports that he's been exceptionally anxious and has been carrying guns in his car, which again is new behavior for him. Once the counselor calls the workforce director back, the counselor indicates that the student should go directly to the local psychiatric hospital to be evaluated for suicidal ideations. The workforce director agrees to accompany the student, but the student is not willing to go to the hospital. So the workforce director again calls the student's girlfriend, who agrees to come to the college to talk to him. The student finally agrees after his girlfriend arrives at 4 o'clock, and the Community and Technical College workforce director agrees to follow him in her vehicle to the hospital. They allow him to drive his own car, along with his therapeutic support dog, to the hospital. So that's the case. And I'm gonna just go back to those questions. And probably the biggest one is, where did the system break down for this particular student? And get some conversation about this, about what could have been done better in this particular case.
Thank you, Dr. Fursley. Who would like to start us off? Don't be shy. It's a good group. Nobody's gonna freak out or anything. Let's see, Carol.
Well, it seems to me that a lot of the issues had to do with just timing. Weekends, lunch breaks, not available, not necessarily having a backup available. And I think that happens all the time at universities. I run into it frequently. I'm a professor, I teach classes, and I try and tell my students ahead of time, look, you're gonna have to plan ahead and ask questions in a timely manner so that I can respond to you. Like, don't ask me a question at 6 p.m. on Sunday when the assignment is due at 11:59 on Sunday. But that's not the only thing that's breaking down here. It just feels like people were afraid to talk with this student. And of course, everybody always wants more information. Like, okay, what else was going on? What's going on here? Why does he have a service dog? What's going on there? What are the underlying situations? And we don't always get that information, especially when things start to escalate.
Yeah, Carol, I think you're right that this kind of communication happens all the time, and these kind of breaks in communication. And to me, one of the things that I think, especially people who are not doing this work, I think people don't understand the urgency of the needs at that particular moment. And I think you're right, that whole idea about backup but an escalation, and really treating things as urgent. I mean, I applaud the preceptor for recognizing these relatively subtle changes in this particular student. But once that preceptor handed off their concerns to their HR director, and their HR director very quickly contacted the college. But then we have a host of characters who are involved that takes then 3 or 4 days before the student really gets care. And I think it's also notable that at no time did the counselor talk to the patient.
I don't know if this helps or not. This idea was introduced by a colleague of mine, and you probably have heard of it. It's one of those, well, of course, kind of things. But he talks about the warm handoff. And what he means, see, head nodding. What that means is that when he's got a student who has an issue, he's a professor in our counseling program, the student has an issue, he's on campus with the student, he will physically stop what he's doing and walk the student over to wherever the student needs to go next. He will stay with the student until he and the student locate the next person of responsibility, and then, give a warm handoff. Hi, this is Phyllis. Phyllis has an issue with not being able to get registered for courses. Can you help her, please? Oh, sure. Great. Hi, I'm whatever, Joan, and I'm going to help you get registered for courses. And then the professor backs off and goes back to what he's doing. Is it a little more labor intensive? Absolutely, in the short term. But in the long term, it helps the student learn the system, learn who to talk to, and all those various things. Is that the sort of feedback that you're looking for, Cynthia?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So the warm handoff is a thing that we do, and I teach a lot remotely. And so what I will do is either I'll do a Zoom call, or I'll put the person on hold and I'll pull a third party into the phone call, or I'll send an email. Whatever it is I can do that is the sort of the electronic equivalent of as warm a handoff as possible. I don't know. Does that help?
Absolutely. I think as we all think about our systems, warm handoffs are the transition between people, right? And we know if we're healthcare providers, we know that transitions of care are where most safety issues occur, right? And this is the same thing, except we're talking about within a community, those transitions between person to person, leaving the student behind, and are so essential. I would also note that it seems like the Community and Technical College tried to offer that transition by having the workforce director go with the student to the hospital to be their support, but they allowed him to drive in his own car where they knew there were guns.
Great comments in the chat about the warm handoffs. I had a question just from not being involved in any of this in day-to-day, but just with Zoom. I think Carol, you mentioned you're at home, working from home. Has that really changed a lot of the procedures that go on? Like, has it cut down any wait times in the sense because you can just get on, or has it made it worse? I mean, I know it's not particular, to the case, but that was an interesting comment.
I don't think anything has been made worse. But again, I'm going to qualify everything I say. Well, it depends. I keep waiting for my students to buy me a box of Depends and put it on my desk, because that's the answer to every question. Well, it depends. Most of my situations are not with students in crisis. So if we're talking about a situation in crisis, again, I think what Cynthia talked about, recognizing the level of urgency involved, particularly for the lived experience of the student, is obviously really, really important. for anybody who works in mental health, that sense of urgency can make things escalate very, very quickly in a matter of seconds, much less days going by. So yeah, the whole notion of knowing what to do to help somebody get regrounded and sort of de-escalated, those are some basic skills that I think every single one of us needs to know. And I think too few of us know those skills, and too few of us know when those skills are actually, oh, now I need to use those skills. Oh, wait, this is the time when I should be doing this. So yeah. So I don't know if I answered your question, Jay.
No, I mean, it's good. I mean, we're all living in this Zoom world. Like, I'm here at home. I mean, this is not my, so, I mean, how do you handle those crisis situations, if you have to do it virtually? It's a different animal, I'm sure.
I think one of the things that I'd like to hear from people about is, how do you bring in the people outside of your counseling center or your mental health counselors? How do you bring them under the fold of understanding about crises and how to manage them? And again, that sense of urgency and the need for warm handoffs. Do any of you have a more systemic approach to that, as opposed to just holding those skills within your counseling center? And I'd like to hear about that because I think a lot of others may be interested in that whole integration of the entire campus community into the need for support for students in crisis.
That is an excellent question. It segues really nicely into the presentation I'll be making next time we meet on trauma-informed campuses, and getting everybody involved. And yeah, it's a work in progress that I think all of us are kind of huffing and puffing to catch up to right now. And what Margaret presented on today, that whole HIPAA and FERPA requirements do end up paralyzing us, because we don't know what it is that we can and should be doing. And in our litigious society, a lot of people are saying, nope, please don't include me. Nope, somebody else can be involved in this, because I don't want to end up giving up years and years and years of my life in a series of hearings that never seem to go anywhere. So we have a very interesting constellation of situations right now with COVID and with working from home, and how COVID acts as a magnifying glass for whatever else is going on in the person's life. I think we all need to learn some basic de-escalation skills, all of us across the entire campus. And I think we also need to recognize that our student body is a whole lot more stressed than they're letting on. That's just my take. Okay, I'll shut up because there are a lot of other people on this call.
This is Kurt with WU Parkersburg. One of the things that I also was watching in the sense of what we read is the director over there was in a bind, trying to make a determination. The council was busy. I'm a one-person counseling center myself, so it's a matter of where are you at which time. But in follow-up to what was just said, even a commitment procedure, if it was deemed to be that much of a significant issue, individuals don't want to get involved in filing those either, which places the options even further stretched, trying to see how you're going to go. And I've accompanied folks by way of following them to the hospital, but the liability of taking someone in my own vehicle, I faced that in the past as well. So trying to get a friend, a family member to drive them isn't always an accessible option. So I saw that this case brought up a lot of tangential issues of what ifs.
I really wanted somebody to ask the question of this young man, are you thinking of hurting yourself or someone else? Before they send them to the emergency room. And I say this in all respect for my colleagues who work in hospitals, because I did that for 40 something years. Sending somebody to hospital is not, even if you do a warm handoff, is no guarantee that that person is going to be admitted. Because if that person doesn't tell them that they're a danger to themselves or someone else, they don't have any information from anyone else, that's not what's going to happen. And then you have somebody who's back out into the community with a somewhat for a follow-up, and they do give them instruction, but I really wanted someone to ask the question. It doesn't necessarily have to be the counselor, someone to ask this person, are you having thoughts of wanting to hurt yourself?
Mhm.
There might have been other interventions that, you know, a safety plan, you know, a crisis unit, something else besides the restrictive environment of a hospital.
And I will say on the from the hospital side, patient arrived with the workforce director, not related, not authorized to receive or provide information, and with a therapeutic service animal that was unknown to the hospital staff when they got a heads up that they were bringing this particular student in for evaluation, which leads to a whole other set of issues for a hospital if there was to be an admission. And then his car is there outside with guns in it. So there, you know, all of that communication from the campus to the hospital was essential as well for, again, considering the safety of that particular patient, the placement of that patient in a, you know, if they were to be admitted into a room, into an environment where the therapeutic service dog would be safe and not distressed, and the patient would be safe, and all kinds of things. But again, that communication, that the whole, and Margaret, you did such a great job talking about what we can disclose with FERPA and with HIPAA. But people are still afraid to do that.
Got
So
some good,
I saw
yeah, in the chat.
Alexander had a comment in the chat, and actually,
There's a couple in
looks
there.
like Kay also. Sounds like they talked to the girlfriend a lot and not so much to the patient. Can you engage campus police to secure guns? I don't know the answer to that question. And then Alexandra said, girlfriend's involvement is definitely a violation unless the student introduced them into the situation themselves. So we don't know that information. Partner and spousal abuse can be a huge contributor to a mental health crisis. So definitely bringing someone else into the situation may be as much of a danger for the patient or student as not bringing them in. But we have to assume in this case that they provided the contact information for the girlfriend.
Janet also had a chat in the beginning where it says, what happens when you don't have a counseling center or a professional at your college?
Mm-hmm.
Great question.
And I think Margaret talked a lot about how important it is to have linkages between your college and your and the system, right? And so especially if you don't have a counseling center, certainly if you have a health center or health staff, they should be able to help to intervene and help to link the patient into the system. But it certainly makes it even more difficult if we haven't trained people on the campuses to be able to respond to a crisis.
And this is Janet, Cynthia. We don't have a health center. We have campuses that don't even have police officers. So, you know, it's really about the regular staff in student services who are dealing with the situation most times. So, particularly at the community colleges, we don't we just don't have those services. And in some communities, they don't have much of those services either, where
Mhm.
campus is. So I guess the question is about how do we train what I would consider regular student services staff to be able to help as much as possible, because all of those things you said are something that has happened at one time or another on our campus.
Sure, sure. So Janet, I think next session that Carol is going to provide on a trauma-informed campus is going to be really essential to you and others who are outside of the healthcare and behavioral health arena, and how important that training is. But also, I would urge every campus to know the community mental health center that serves their area, and how to access that community mental health center in a crisis, because the way that the community mental health system is set up in the state is that there are a number of community mental health centers that are assigned to either counties or geographic areas. And so they are really served as being kind of the front line of community mental health. And so developing those relationships are really essential. And again, that goes back to what Margaret said also, is getting people into the least restrictive level of care. And oftentimes the community mental health centers will have crisis support, crisis teams. They may have a mobile crisis team. They may be able to provide a lower level of care than certainly sending a patient to either a psychiatric hospital or to an emergency room, which is the worst, absolute worst place to send a patient in psychiatric crisis, in my humble opinion.
Hear, hear. And these days it's even worse because the emergency rooms are still completely overrun with COVID. And again, this is a completely unscientific opinion, but my sense is that the burnout that has happened to all of our healthcare professionals is going to have a very long tail to it. And that there's going to be this sense of burnout, and please don't ask me to do anything more in crisis situations at our emergency rooms for some time to come. So I guess the cautionary tale I'm getting from the case presentation is, can someone please make eye contact with the student and sit down in a room together and say, hey, hang on, let's figure out what's going on, and let's figure out together what your options are, and then formulate a plan, and we can move forward together. And is that too adult? Is that too mature? I'm not sure what the right answer is. I think we're, all of us, me included, we're scared to death of liability. Liability seems to drive everything, and it's like hands off all the time. But I think that hands off approach to things has ended up creating more liability rather than less. Again, that's just my opinion.
And I would agree with you. I don't think it's too adult. I think it is a case where there hasn't been enough training of the general campus population, or the general public for that matter, in how to do that and how to feel some level of comfort, and then knowing that you have support behind you if you do get into a situation like that.
And that speaks to the question you raised. Why didn't anybody ask this young man, are you thinking of hurting yourself or somebody else? I think people are afraid to ask that question because they don't know what to do with the answer.
Exactly.
Like, what if the answer is, why, yes, if they're going to be that candid.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But asking the question and connecting with that person is just reduced the likelihood that they're going to do something. So it's therapeutic in addition to information gathering.
Everything is paradoxical. Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
Yeah.
We did a couple of, go ahead. Hey, go ahead, Kat.
I was just going to say, the other issue is, if you want this whole campus-wide thing, I think it really has to be top-down supported. So we're going to have you know, you're going to have people that are like, not my job, not my, you know, and and I worked at a university where a lot of the students were going to be pilots. A lot of the students were going to be, you know, NASA engineers. And the professors actually were resistant to, even in the, like, we had mental health first aid for them. And one of them walked out of the mental health first aid class because he's like, I'm not going to take a kid to counseling if it means he's going to lose his career. And I'm like, you know, maybe we should worry about him losing his life and then like figure out the career as we go. But and so what ended up happening was he ended up going, kind of being reprimanded and having to go back to class. Like, you know, there was lots of support above us to make sure that he understood that this was a critical and key point that needed to happen. But if we hadn't had that institutional backup, he'd have gone away, told his colleagues, and they wouldn't have come to the classes either. You know, so I think that especially for those places that are trying to rely on their faculty and staff to be a part of it, that institutional support and backup, who's going to back us up when that happens? Who's in your pocket? So let's say you did do something and you felt it was the most expedient thing, and it was protecting the student, and maybe you did something out of order or out of line, or you did it wrong. I think we need to know that the institution is going to support us and back us up. So just like in last ECHO, when we had that situation, it was kind of like, you got to do in the moment, make it work the best. And you need to be able to trust that your university or institution is going to back you up. So we aren't so tied up in this, I'm afraid of personal litigation.
Okay, I think that's a really, really good perspective. And it makes me even more interested in hearing about a trauma-informed campus. And because it's infusing a cultural change within a campus, that change in culture to one of trust and one of action. And I think that I can't wait. Carol, lots of pressure on you for next time, right?
I'm really feeling it. Yeah.
Yeah, no pressure, but
okay, I'm going to fix all the world's problems next week.
Yeah, I do really think that that's important, and having that transparency, that support, and that really a change in campus culture to it's all of our responsibilities is one that will be so essential in trying to get people to where they need to be safe, to get the care that they need so they can be successful in their education. That's the bottom line, right? Healthy and then successful in their education.
Very good. Great segue. Yeah, I didn't have to do it. You guys really made my job easy for setting up the next session. So yeah, Carol, it's on you. But I will say for the next session, we do need a case. So please let me know, let Carolyn know. I think she just dropped it in the chat about presenting a case. We really would appreciate it. Let us know if you have any questions. We'll help you make the case and make it manageable for you. I also dropped in the evaluation for today's session. It'll also be included in the recap email that everybody will get. But if you have time now, feel free to follow that link and fill out the evaluation. Also, there's a couple of good links that are dropped in the chat from Carolyn and others. Those will be in the recap as well. So don't worry if you don't grab certain ones, you will get them. And we look forward to the next session. Thank you to Margaret and Cynthia for your presentations. We really appreciate it. Everybody's comments, and another great session. So we'll try to go for 3 in a row here in a couple of weeks. All right. Take care, everybody.